Hello, everybody. Welcome. Still awake after lunch? I know the blood will probably going somewhere else, but we'll try to pick you right up. So welcome to Practical Azure DevOps for data platforms. We're going to do some cool stuff with a whole variety of different things.
So before we get started, a big thanks to all of the sponsors for today's event. Without sponsors, events like this are just simply not possible. So make sure you go and visit as many sponsors as you can today, even if you work for one.
Yeah. So for the next 60 minutes or so, we're going to talk about Azure DevOps, and we're going to reference the cloud and on-prem version of it. We'll not dive too deep into those different things, but keep it practical. We're going to do the boards, the repos, so with source control and all those kind of things, the pipelines, the test plans, the artifacts, and then we're going to do something with Power BI and Fabric as well. So,
before we go any further,
yeah,
shall we introduce ourselves?
Yeah, shall we? So, I'm Sander. I am a data platform engineer for Data Masterminds. I've worked in IT for over 20 years from a variety of industries, from agriculture to healthcare. I'm also a Microsoft MVP and a major contributor to the DBA Tools project. If you want to follow me on, this is still an old icon. Why didn't you change that? On X or /Twitter, I have a blog where I try to write as much as I can. And if you have any questions after this session, feel free to send me an email. There's also a lot of demos on my GitHub repo, including stuff for this session, and also combined with the repos from Kevin. So no, Kevin has a slightly more complicated bio than me. So
thanks for that. So yeah, my name is Kevin Chant. I'm a data engineering manager living in the Netherlands. However, some of you may be able to pick up from the accent, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. So basically I'm an Englishman, living in the Netherlands, working for a large international company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, if you kept up with all of that, you're in a good place for this session. Now, I've worked in IT since the days of Windows 95, and over that time I've had experience in various sectors. In addition to that, I have various certifications, including the latest Fabric one. In addition to that, Microsoft Certified Trainer, and also currently a dual category MVP. Now, just like my co-presenter, you can find me in a few different places online. So you can find me on Twitter, Blue Sky, Mastodon, etc. Most of the time is at KevChant. You can find me on LinkedIn. I have my own blog where I post a lot about data platform and developer technologies, quite often the two together. And I have my own GitHub page as well, where I share quite a few repositories that people can download and use as templates to perform CI/CD for various items such as SQL Server, Azure Synapse SQL pools, and more recently Microsoft Fabric data warehouses. Anyway, now that's out of the way, I suppose better go and introduce Azure DevOps to everybody to an extent.
It's going to be a lot of demos.
Right, so for those of you who have not seen much of it before, this is the home screen you tend to go to when you first go into Azure DevOps. On the top left hand side, you have a little icon, and that represents your home page effectively. Underneath, you'll see a list of organizations that your account has got access to. Now, I'll just quickly add here, this is the account within a certain tenant, because your account could in reality be in multiple tenants. So these organizations could be the company you work for, or if you work for a large enterprise, a division within them, or it could be one you've created for testing purposes. Now, if you've got the relevant permissions, you can change various settings at the organization level. As you can see, there's a few general settings you can see here. I'm not going to go through each one. This is a 60-minute session. One key thing to highlight in general is the fact they finally changed Azure AD to Microsoft Entra here now. So you can set various security settings. We'll be covering boards shortly, but I will show you now to access the different processes. You can do it from the organization settings. Again, if you have the right permissions. There's various pipeline settings you can change here. So there's agent pools, and this is where you can create agent pools at an organization level so different projects can use them. Just to give a bit of context here, and we'll talk about it a bit later. When you do work in Azure pipelines, Azure DevOps doesn't do the work itself. It sends it all to machines behind the scenes for you, and these machines are called agents. So you can specify to create them either at the organization level, like we do here, or the project level, which you'll see shortly. Now, there are some settings I better highlight here. They are a little bit controversial, but I do have to highlight them to everybody. So a while ago, Microsoft added 2 new settings here to allow you to disable the classic pipelines. So that's the GUI based classic editor and the GUI based releases feature. Microsoft now give Azure DevOps administrators the rights to disable those across the entire organization. Now, I do understand that a lot of people in the data platform community are keen on these pipelines, but Microsoft do have their reasons. Anyway, scrolling further down for other settings, you can change some various repository settings here, as well as look at your artifact storage amount. So, every organization has one or more projects within them, and these projects are basically logical groupings. For example, a project that's taking place, or it could be a team or a group of teams together, all share the same project. In this particular project, and I'll extend this here so it's all visible, you can see the default services that were installed when you first set up Azure DevOps. Now, since Sandra mentioned about it earlier, there are 2 versions of Azure DevOps. There's Azure DevOps Services, which is a cloud-based version. That's what we're showing you today. And there's Azure DevOps Server, which is basically a rebranded version of Team Foundation Server, to be honest with you. And that's the version that you can install yourself on premises. Anyway, Azure DevOps contains a default set of services, and the ones you see here are Azure boards, and this is where you manage your work items. Azure repos, and this is a visual representation of your repositories, and we'll talk a bit more about those shortly as well. Azure pipelines, and this is where you manage your deployments. Azure test plans, and this is where you can manage your test plans without having to create spreadsheets. And finally, Azure artifacts, and this is where you can store artifact feeds that people can download and use within the business. And as I mentioned just now, just like with organization settings, you can manage various project settings as well. In reality, in the real world, especially if you're working in a large organization, these are probably the settings you have the most influence over. So again, there's general settings here, but you can do a few different things like connect up the service hooks, because you won't connect the third-party services at an organization level. You can change various board settings here, for example, set up your sprints, etc., or connect to GitHub. You can manage pipeline settings at a project level here. So obviously you have an organization, they manage various settings at the organization level for everybody. But if you're in a team and you're working autonomously, basically if you're an independent team, you can manage your own settings here as well. For example, it might be possible for you to create your own agent pools at the project level. And you'll probably want to create your service connections here as well, because you don't want everybody in your company to have access to, for example, your Azure resource groups.
Where everybody knows a certain release and everybody gets to know, right?
Exactly. So this just highlights something, a piece of advice for all of you. If you do set up service connections to your Azure resources, make sure you give them a nice, friendly username. Not only is it easier for you to find, but it also means that it won't show the subscriber ID by default, because if you just do the click, 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 it's going to show your Azure subscription ID there. So bear that in mind. So again, we can change repository settings, we can view artifact settings, we can set retention settings for our test plans within the project. And we can also manage settings for various what's known as extensions as well. So you get the set of default services like I mentioned earlier in Azure DevOps, but you can extend this by actually getting more items from the marketplace. So you can click on marketplace, and then from there just go to easily find extra ones. And I'll do you a quick example here. Be very quick about this, hopefully. So as you can see already, there's a variety of extra things I can add to this as well. So I just wanted to show this for all of you.
You need to have the right permissions, by the way, to install these extensions. So talk to your Azure administrator or your Azure DevOps administrator to install these if you don't have those permissions.
Yeah, because you'll have to request permissions otherwise, and that can be an online process as well. And make you tick a little thing to say send to your admin to request. So
yeah, so you've seen a lot of settings. There's a whole world of things that we can already set, like the parallel jobs or any parallel settings that we can do. So we only have an hour, so we're not going to go through all these settings. Let's go.
We can cut over, but we're just going to be going back to me anyway.
Yeah.
So
Azure boards, right?
So we cut back over to me now. There you go. So now we've covered the organization and project setup for Azure DevOps, and you've had a basic introduction basically. We'll talk about Azure boards now, and this is where you can manage your work items. Don't worry, I'm only clicking on the work items item because it's at the top of the list. So within your project in Azure DevOps, you can work based on various different templates. Do you work either using Agile, Scrum, at basic level, or even just all CMMI as well, for those of you who work with that. And you can do all of this within Azure DevOps by using the Azure Board service. And this comes with some default items, as you can see here. So you have work items, and this just shows every single type of work item in your project in a linear format. I quite like this because if you accidentally delete something, you can find it here. Then you have boards, and this allows you to work in a Kanban or Scrumban kind of way. You have a backlog, so those of you who work with Agile or Scrum will be familiar with the backlog concept, and this is just where you put all your work items before they're ready for a sprint or iteration. Then you have sprints, so if you've got items in your current sprint, you can put them in the sprint task book like we've got here. So as you can see, we've already got a work item here, so backlog item ready, and different tasks. We've also got queries that you can do, so you can query against your work items. So for example, I've got a query here, and if I run this particular query, you can see there's one task that's still open by Sander.
Oh, sorry. Been quite busy.
So when you go to create a new query, you get a query designer, which may be familiar to those of you who have worked with database designers in the past. So we also have delivery plans and other additional things that you can add as part of extensions. So,
okay. Well, show me how the Scrum items are organized, because I'm not that familiar.
So if you are using the Scrum process in Azure DevOps, it's epics, features, and backlog items. If you're using Agile, the default processes are epics, features, and user stories. But all of this is fully customizable. I've just shown you the basic introduction. Let's see if something a bit more interesting here. So, say for example, we go into a particular backlog item. I can click on the ellipsis up here and scroll down to customize. Now what this does, this takes me directly to where I can customize this particular item in Azure DevOps. So instead of navigating through the organization settings, drilling down, checking I've got the right process, going into that process and then clicking the item, I can just click customize from that object if I've got the right permissions. Now, as you can see, we can fully customize, we can add extra things here. A popular thing a lot of people tend to do in these kind of work items is add a stakeholder as well. So just thought I'd better show that for everybody.
Okay, so so I've been doing a lot of stuff with PowerShell and Power BI lately. Can we view those sprints in Power BI?
You mean use the information that's, for example, on this dashboard?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got a few different options to do that actually, and I just happen to have a few examples now. So, first of all, the most easiest one to do if you're just used to Azure DevOps is dashboards, but that means you just use your visualization knowledge really from Power BI. That's not really Power BI oriented. However, what you can also do from there is create something known as analytics views. So, for example, and now the analytics view seems to have completely disappeared. Back again. So, as you can see here, they are a list of predefined views in Azure DevOps, and I've actually created 2 custom ones here. So, and you can think of these along the lines of views you create in the SQL Server, because it is just a view layer you create on top of your work item metrics in Azure DevOps. So as you can see here, I'm just created a view that's going to show me all the backlog items in Sprint 2. And done a similar thing for tasks as well. But what I've actually done with tasks is a bit different, because we're actually setting the history to be collected on a daily basis. And that's so if you want to, we can create our own burn down chart based on those metrics from each day. And I can actually show you how we do this now in Power BI Desktop. So for those of you used to Power BI Desktop, and you don't need to strain your eyes, I will zoom in on the most important parts. What we can do here is actually click on more, click on get data, and then select more. I'm just going to type in Azure DevOps here. And I can just select boards only. This will then ask me for project and organization, and I happen to have these details to hand here. So I'm just going to copy this over.
By the way, if you have any questions, just ask them midway through the session. Doesn't really matter.
And then as you can see here, I can just select any of those views I want to use in my Power BI report. And that's it really. And the other one I was just going to quickly show you is that you can also work with OData queries to directly query to the analytics in Azure DevOps as well. And you can actually copy and paste these directly into a Power BI source if you want to. So you have a few different options basically. Analytics views, to be honest, if you're from a Power BI background, are probably easier for you because it's a visualization, easy, nice way to do it visually. Whereas if you've already got a development background, OData may be better. So now we're going to cover Azure repos.
Yeah, we are. So we're going to cut over. So Azure repos is where we're going to save our data, right? So before we start using Git, there's no branch model. There's just the main. So we want to create something that is workable, but there are some defaults out there that you can use. So the first one is the Git flow, which everybody's probably familiar with, which we have a main, we have hotfixes, we have releases, and all different kinds of branches, and they all go up and down wherever you need. But there are some pros and cons with it. The complete set of rules, very thorough. It's easy to switch between the different development and other branches, but because it's such a complete complex thing, it's not very agile, right? We don't use this for agile working. Another one is the GitLab flow, which is completely different. Instead of branches, we actually use environments. So we have staging, pre-prod, prod, or whatever environment that you want to use. And it kind of goes all the way down to the production. So there's no way that it goes out back, right? So everything is tested in all environments, which is a good thing. You always know what lives in production, which is also very good. And it, like I said, it merges all the way down, like the waterfall method that you maybe are familiar with. You have to assume that the main branch is free of errors, otherwise it's errors all the way down. There's no release validation to test. And if you have a hot fix, you have to update every single branch in that regard. Another one that we have is trunk-based or GitHub Flow or Microsoft Release Flow. We don't have any we don't have any other branches like development or releases. We just have the main and we have feature branches. Clear and simple. That is it. Makes it. So the question is, would you, when would you do fixed branches or feature branches? I always tell people it should support your development process. So if you, as long as it's clear for your dev environment, for your devs, it's good to work with. But there's no set number of branches that I would use. I would just use that something that supports the development process. So if you want to do a mix between the different branching models, go ahead. Any more questions? Okay. So this is pretty easy to implement. Very agile, because if a feature is ready and tested, it goes back into main, so you get really fast deployments. Speed comes at a cost. So if you're not organizing this very well in any kind of board or any other overview, it's going to get complicated real fast. It's hard to test multiple features. So if one feature is reliant on another, then from a different branch, then testing is going to be really difficult. And the main branch is both development and production, which may be a problem for you. There are also branch strategies. If you're so we have rebase, where basically what you do is you merge all your commits back to a certain branch. In this case, it's main, without having other commits necessary. If you have lots and lots and lots and lots of commits, like hundreds of them, it may be easier to squash them down to one or two. So that's what that command does. It squashes it down to a single commit, and then you can do a rebase or work further along with that. We also have fast forward and no fast forward. So with no fast forward, we create another commit, and then we merge into the main branch or any other branch. But with fast forward, we don't create another commit. That's kind of how this works, right? Most of the time, you will do no fast forward. Okay, any questions about this? It's basically the same. Does the same thing. Good question.
It depends on your release cycles.
Yeah.
I mean, you probably want to keep all three of them separated initially so they're loosely coupled. And then as time goes by, if you think that you can get away with putting them into one, then you can test it. But to be honest, keeping it loosely coupled, especially since you just mentioned ADF and you may eventually look to use pipelines on another product, it might be a good idea to keep them separated and loosely coupled.
I have a client where I have to combine different branches, and actually during my build process, I do a git clone in one of the pipelines and combine them that way to do a build or do a release from there on. So there are so many things, but as long as it supports your release, it's good.
Shall we very quickly show everybody how the Git repository would look in Azure DevOps, just to give everybody a bit of context to this? So this is a visual representation of your repository in Azure DevOps. I'm sure some of you have already seen this. So your repository in Azure DevOps, which is stored in Azure repos, they can either be Git or TFVC, but to be honest with you, most people tend to stick with using Git. As you can see, there's various things you can look at on the left hand side here, so commits, pushes, branches. This gives some context to the branch stuff that Sander was showing you just now, and you can do some interesting things here, and we'll see some of this in action later on. So for example, we can set branch policies if it loads up. So for example, various settings, minimum number of reviewers, a pull request, etc. Build validation, which you'll see in the demo later on, etc., etc. But the main thing we wanted you to take away from this is obviously how your repositories are visualized in Azure repos. So, very quick introduction for you all there.
Any questions until we go to the next section? Next section, not session.
Not section. Okay.
Pipelines. So this is where actually all the magic happens, right? Then you do the builds, you do all the preparations. It allows you to create the agent pools, which you can actually do the cloud version of the agent, or you can leverage agent on-prem, which can run as a service or as an application. There is the classic editor. Shouldn't use it anymore. Just use YAML.
And for those of you wondering what are one of the main advantages with the YAML pipelines, you can't do pull requests with the classic pipelines. As nice and as easy and as intuitive as they are, that's the reality. You can't do a pull request on them, and they're not as portable. Anyway, back over here.
Yeah. So so this is a list of all the different things that we can do with pipelines. We can deploy to Azure services. We could do all kinds of builds and deployments for database projects, both SQL Server, Azure Synapse, Azure Synapse SQL pools, and Fabric data warehouses as well, because it's basically same kind of thing. Azure Data Factory with Azure Synapse pipelines as well, and Azure Synapse workspaces. Databricks, notebooks, Microsoft Fabric, which we will see later on. We are going to do a Git integration with Power BI projects as well. So as an example, how a deployment will go, you have different environments set up, and you go from deploying automatically to the next, and maybe then the last one you need an approval. So per environment you can set if you need an approval to deploy to the next step, if you're doing automatic unit testing or anything like that. This is a SQL Server database example. Basically the same thing. We have a new table, deploy it all the way up to UAT, and then from UAT, before we go to production, we do an approval in there. So now, because I know very little about Fabric,
he wants me to talk about this part. So yeah, you can do it with Fabric as well. So can I just have a show of hands? Who's working with Power BI at the moment, or who has experience of it? Who's worked with Power BI projects at this moment in time? So what you can do is take that project, as some of you probably already know, you can save a copy of it locally on your machine, make your local copy a Git repository, synchronize that with a repository in Azure DevOps, and then use that as part of Git integration, so you can use it to deploy to one or more workspaces in Fabric. So for example, if you have a development workspace and a production workspace, you can deploy first to the development workspace and then do a pull request to actually synchronize another workspace which is using a different branch. Anyway, cool. Back over to you.
Back over to me. So,
briefly.
Yeah, we're going to do demos. Just sit down and do them. I'm just a pretty monkey, just clicking the button. Well, pretty, just a monkey.
I thought you were a Bez.
Bez? They don't know about Bez.
There's somebody here from the UK, they know who Bez is. Okay, so let's first of all do some SQL Server examples. So say for example, and we'll just move this one here. So I have installed on here, and the extension went down from here. I have in Azure Data Studio a extension called SQL Database Projects. And this allows me to work with database projects within Azure Data Studio, so that the same database projects some of you may have worked with in Visual Studio Professional or Enterprise over the years. So because of this, I'm able to work with a project, like I said, in Azure Data Studio. And I can do various things here. So I've saved this database project locally into a folder, and I use source control in Azure Data Studio to initialize it already as a Git repository locally. And that local copy is then synchronized with a Git repository in Azure DevOps. So let's very quickly do a demo here to show this. So as you can see at the bottom here, I'm using a feature branch. And all I'm just going to quickly do, I'm just going to save this change. Source control will then realize I've made the change and say, do you want to actually commit this? To help with some jargon, commit basically hardens the change. So I'm just going to say here, change col, because I'm too lazy to finish saying column. Once I've done that, it very kindly invites me to synchronize it with the repository stored in Azure DevOps. So I'm going to do that now. If we go back to the repository in Azure DevOps, and I'll F11 out of this for now so I can actually get this easy refresh. You will see in the feature branch, I've just made a change. So what I can do then is actually look to create a DAT pack based on the contents of that repository. So for those of you who don't know, a DAT pack is a special file that you can use to deploy updates to other SQL Server databases.
Basically a glorified zip file containing all the objects.
So even though I did say earlier that classic pipelines are going, we do some demos here with this to help explain the concept. So this is a classic editor pipeline, and all I'm doing here is taking the contents of the repository in that feature branch. I'm actually building a database project from it. In other words, I'm creating that DAT pack file, and then I'm publishing it back into Azure DevOps. Now, to save a bit of time here, here's one I did earlier. So if we go back to it again, and you'll see there's a completed one. And if I scroll down, you will see that indeed it did create that DAT pack file. So that's the first step. So that's your CI side of it. You've created a DAT pack. What you can then do is go to the releases feature, and then you can create what's known as a release to deploy that DAT pack, or at least the contents of it, to a SQL Server database. So here, what I'm saying is, get the latest DAT pack, get the latest build basically. And then from there, it can deploy to one or more stages. So for example, here in this stage, it's got two tasks, quite simple. Downloads that artifact that contains the DAT pack, and then deploys it to a SQL Server instance. Now, that's fine, but what about if I want to use YAML pipelines instead? or if I want to perform some CI/CD. Well, if we go back to this repository, what I can do, because it's on the feature branch, I'm first going to initiate what's called a pull request. And a pull request, I'm literally asking for permission to merge from one branch to the other. So the contents of the feature branch, the updates, to go to my main branch. So I'm just going to do that now quickly. Approve and complete for the benefit of time. Click on complete merge. And then when I go to pipelines, you will see it's already running. Now, if I click on edit here, you will see that the main reason it's running is because I've got a trigger that says whenever I'll zoom in on this for everybody, whenever the main branch is updated, run this pipeline. So that's what it's doing at the moment. Now, apologies for those of you who are not overly keen on YAML code here, but I will quickly scroll through to explain a few things, because this is basically a code-based version of what I just showed you in the other two pipelines. So first of all, as you can see again, I'm just building the artifact, and then I'm publishing it to Azure DevOps like I showed you in Classic Editor. And then afterwards, I'm doing the deployment like I showed you in the releases feature. So I'm just essentially doing all of this in one piece of code instead of two different places.
By the way, every little action has settings, so you can click on the settings and then it opens a window on the side if you need more information what to fill in for that particular extension.
You mean the assistant, yeah?
Marketplace assistant, yeah.
Yeah, so you have a little assistant here, so you don't necessarily have to remember all of this code. Now, something else here I should highlight whilst we're going back to this YAML pipeline is that you'll see I've got some variable groups here, and you will create these in the library feature. Now here I've created two library groups. So I've got one that contains non-sensitive values, and that's just for variables that I want to use in the pipeline again and again, which aren't sensitive. And the other one has sensitive values in there which are stored away in key vault. So all I literally do here, I can click on add and select any of the secrets from a particular key vault I want to connect to. And that's how you can keep things like username, passwords, subscription IDs, etc. secret in your Azure Pipelines code. Now, that's an example of just doing a deployment to one database. But what about if you want to deploy it to many databases and you want to do some unit testing as well?
Nobody does unit testing.
Well, you
But
do.
everybody does, right?
So as you can see, like the flow in the diagram here, so going from an initial build to doing some unit tests and then deploying to different environments. Well, I will show you quickly the code to do this. So the logic behind this is, well, simple-ish to an extent. And in order to help explain this, I actually have to go back into Azure Data Studio as well, into a separate pipeline I've got. So whereas earlier I had one database project just to deploy and update to one or more databases, here I've got two separate, and I do need to zoom in again here, database projects. One that contains the schema of the SQL database I want updated everywhere. And then I've got a second database project which literally just contains the schema for the unit test, because I only want to deploy the unit test material on one specific server. Which, if I go here, you can see I've got one database instance on a container, and it's going to run all the unit tests on that one particular database. If it passes those unit tests, then it will deploy to the other databases like you can see up here. So in order to do that, first of all, we actually build both of those database projects and upload them, so you essentially have two DATPack files. And then we have a unit testing stage, and this stage is different from the others because this is the only stage where we will deploy both DATPacks. And that's so that we can run the T-SQL-T unit tests against that particular database. So as you can see here, you scroll down, we're installing the DAT packs. I'm not going to take my time on this. And then we're going to issue the command to run the unit test itself. And then once we've run the unit tests, we can actually send the results back into Azure DevOps so we can visualize the results if we need to. And then from there, it's just multiple bit of replication from what you saw earlier.
We have one question from the chat. So the question is, what if we have over 100 databases in which changes need to be made?
That's a very nice open-ended question there. You can perform state-based migrations to over 100 databases. I've worked for a company and we've done it for a four-figure number of instances. You can either use a similar approach to this if they've got a lot of time and they want to create a YAML file with 100 separate ones, very doubtful. Or they can wait a few seconds and I will show the other pipeline where you can actually do this. So you can do it using PowerShell basically. To reiterate through the deployments, they can do what's known as ring-based deployments, so they can deploy to a group of databases at a time. I do have that pipeline actually here, I can show it in a minute. So that's the answer to the question. So anyway, the only other thing I wanted to highlight in this particular one, we scroll further down, is that you'll see I've got an environment here called production. You can manage environments in, well, for YAML pipelines using the environments feature. If I go to this particular one, you can see that I can set approvals here. So whenever that pipeline I just show you runs, every time it goes to deploy to the production stage, it's always going to ask for an approval. So I just wanted to highlight that before I went and showed the answer to the previous question. So we can do ring-based deployments here, so you can deploy to a group of SQL servers at once. Clearly, running that individual task 100 times or even more is not really feasible in the real world. So what you can do, and there are multiple ways to do this, is use a loop in PowerShell to do the deployments en masse. And I just want to show that down the bottom here. So as you can see, we're just building up some variables. And we're listing the servers in an array here. And then what we're doing towards the bottom, we're using a for each, and we are literally just running through that loop to deploy to multiple SQL servers at once. So like I said, if you had production and you had 10, 15, 20, 100, 1,000 SQL servers there, you can keep the list of all those servers somewhere, wherever you want to. And then just use PowerShell in your YAML pipeline to loop through and deploy one at a time. Now, the reality is once you start going over 100, maybe even more than 50 to be honest, you probably want to start adding additional more advanced things like logging, etc. And this is where something like Universal Desktop will come into play, will be helpful for you because you can use that to help with your logging, etc. So finally, just to show that we're not biased, all the demos I've shown you so far are what's known as a state-based deployment. So we're copying the state of a database, putting it everywhere else. You can do what's known as a migration-based deployment, and that's where you build up your SQL scripts to run over time and just deploy those scripts. So you can do this on a budget for SQL Server using dbup. And you basically create a project like this, and I've actually got one here in Visual Studio I can show you. So the idea is you just add additional scripts over time. Whenever you go to update a database, it will just deploy the newer versions of the script. It checks in a table to see if the scripts have been run or not, and you can do that. Now, it's worth highlighting that premium tools are available to do this, but obviously they come at a premium cost as well. They have more advanced features, but if you're on a budget, this is open source, so you can look to use this instead. What you can do then is use the dbops PowerShell module to actually do the deployments in Azure DevOps. And I'm just going to very quickly show you how nice and graceful running it is with DevOps. So as you can see down here, once we've checked the modules installed or not, we then just run literally 2 lines of code, and that will run the deployment against the SQL Server for you. So basically it'll run those scripts I showed you just now, but only the ones that haven't been run, because it stores it, like I said, in a SQL table. Right, that's the last, well, I kind of half like that. That's the last SQL Server demo I'll show you, not the last database project demo, because I just want to show you something very quickly. So here in Fabric, Microsoft Fabric I should say. So who has worked with Microsoft Fabric so far? Right, so for the benefit of those who haven't, you can get a thing now in Microsoft Fabric called a data warehouse. So it's very similar to other warehouse products you may have worked with Microsoft over the years. However, I can connect to this remotely by getting a connection string. And now, because this is being streamed, etc., I'm not going to show my connection string here, but you click on the icon and it will show the string. So, which means that I can connect to it in Azure Data Studio. However, not only can I connect to it in Azure Data Studio, I can create a database project from it, exactly the same as you create a database project against a SQL Server database. So, as the saying goes in the UK, here's one I created earlier. And I've actually deployed this to another Fabric data warehouse. So I just want to make everybody aware this is an option as well. To manage expectations, you can't use this with auto table at this moment in time, because there is a limitation with auto table and data warehouse. However, if you're only updating views, for example, or store procedures in a Fabric data warehouse, you can perform CI/CD by using database projects. So, just wanted to quickly show you all that. Now let's go over and do what might be a bit more interesting demo for some people. So as Sander mentioned earlier, now when you work in Power BI, you can actually save as a Power BI project if you have this setting in place in Power BI Desktop. So if you go, for example, the preview features, you'll notice there's a new setting here, Power BI Project Save option, and I've also selected Store Semantic Model as Tyndall, because that creates some nice readable files for me. Not going to go into too much detail about Tyndall, it's not a Tyndall related session. So, once I've saved this as a Power BI project, it stores it as a collection of files locally, which, just like we did earlier with the database projects, we can make this folder a Git repository locally and synchronize it with a repository in Azure DevOps. So just to show this in real time, because we still got a bit of time to do this quickly.
About 10 minutes.
We've got 10 minutes, it's fine. So I'm just going to rename the backlog. But to be honest, this is quite a good demo to show all of you. So I'm just going to save this. Once I save that change, it recognizes that I need to commit that change to the local Git repository. For those of you, because I will be doing this fast, I do have a blog post about this, by the way, so don't panic if it's too fast for you. So, you save the change, and that will save to a repository that I've got stored in Azure DevOps. So, if we go over to Microsoft Fabric now, and I find it. If I go to this particular workspace and I go to workspace settings and I click on Git integration. So for those who aren't aware, you can do Git integration now in Microsoft Fabric. You can link it basically to a Git repository. Certain items are now supported. Power BI reports and semantic models are 2 of them. So here, as you can see in Git integration, I've got it pointing to the dev branch, which I just updated. And it's recognized already there's a change. So I'm just going to update. Once that update's done, this report here is being updated with the change you saw just now with the new page name. However, I have a separate workspace for what you could think of as the production workspace. And if I go to the workspace settings for this one, you'll notice I've got it set to a different branch, so the main branch effectively. And if I open the report up at the moment, when it finally opens up, it will show the old name still. So what we have to do from here, we can create a pull request to update the branch. So I'm just going to quickly go through this.
Technically, you don't need to create a pull request, but you set the branching policies that way.
I set the branching policies that way because, as you can see, it's now running a pipeline. And it's running a pipeline because I have a branch policy in place. And basically, this branch policy says that every time I'm trying to do the merge from my development workspace to my main workspace, I want it to run a pipeline. This particular pipeline, to cut a long story short, for those of you who work with Power BI, it runs a YAML pipeline that downloads Tabular Editor and the default set of best practices analyzer settings in the JSON file. It then runs that against your semantic model that was in that repository. It also does a similar thing using the community tool PBIX Inspector. That checks to make sure that your report is valid. And then only if your semantic model and your report are fine will it let you finish doing that pull request. So basically, this is CI for your Power BI report and semantic model. So it's still running at the moment. Once that's done, I can set it to complete. And then when I go into the other repository, well, there you go. Set it to complete there. I'm doing this part of the demo extremely fast now, just to make sure we catch up before the end. So if we go into this production, oh, we're not in the production one now, so I go back again. So now when I go back into here, it recognizes there is a change. And that will reflect the change I made just now in Power BI Desktop to my production workspace. Anyway, I appreciate that this was a fast version of this demo. I do have a couple of blog posts relating to this, so feel free to have a look. Cool. And back over the cut.
Yeah. Azure test plans.
So that's back over to me again.
Yeah.
So I'll quickly cover now Azure test plans. I want to talk about these because basically this is where you can create all your test cases without having to rely on spreadsheets anymore. And I think that's great because it avoids something I call spreadsheet sprawl. And that's basically where one person who's actually doing the test has a copy of their spreadsheet, their manager has a different copy, somebody else has a different copy of the spreadsheet stored in their inbox they're using as a reference point. To avoid doing all of that, you can just do it in Azure DevOps, store the results in there, and people can go and look at the single source of truth. Now, I'll just quickly highlight, there are 3 different test suites you can create here. So you've got a static suite, and that's where you have full control over everything. Requirements-based suite, and that's where you create your tests based on certain work items. And query-based suite, which will find existing test cases you've created for individual work items, and any new test cases you create in work items which match that criteria will automatically be added as well. And then once you've done that and you've created your test suite, for example, you can open up and do your tests in a nice friendly web application, and you can even have images in here and everything. I'm a big fan of Azure test plans because I've seen what happens with this spreadsheet sprawl in the past with multiple copies, and I do recommend, if you've got the right licenses, to look to use it.
This is especially for UAT, so when you test the user acceptance tests and everything, you can create another issue or a problem from there directly back, and then make sure they fix it. So that's the entire CI/CD workflow.
Yeah. So I think this section is pretty much covered for now.
Mm-hmm.
Quick overview. So now we're going to quickly talk about Azure Artifacts. I won't even flip the screen for the switch for that because we can go straight to it from here. So Azure Artifacts allows you to store certain types of what they call feeds in Azure DevOps. These can support certain things like NuGet packages, Maven, etc. Or one that's rather interestingly called Universal Package, and that literally is any package type at all, to be honest with you, or just a collection of PowerShell modules like you can see here. And the idea is you can save these certain feeds in Azure DevOps, and that means that your colleagues can download the feeds from there instead of all trying, for example, to download packages from a very popular site at the same time. So that's a very brief explanation there. You can download them as well. I'll quickly show that. So you can just issue a command and you can download from those feeds locally if you want to. Anyway, that is
The recap. That's for you.
it is for me.
Yeah.
Well, I need
Not
the
mine.
clicker then. Can I have the clicker?
No?
So just to recap for all of you, we went through Azure boards to how you manage, so you show you how you can manage your work items in Azure DevOps gracefully. And of course, we could have talked about that for a very long time, to be honest with you, because there's a lot behind it. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about it. Then we went through Azure repos to store your repositories, preferably Git repositories. Then we showed you how you can do your CI/CD using Azure pipelines. We also, as you saw just now, showed how you can actually use Azure Artifacts to store those packages as well. And like Sander mentioned, how you can use Azure Test Plans to manage all of your test cases, etc., without having to work with spreadsheets anymore. So it's all in one central place, easy to find, etc. And just for good measure, we showed you how you can view the metrics within Azure DevOps in Power BI in various places. And to be honest, we could have added Fabric in this part as well. So that was it. Are there any questions for it from anybody? And whilst we're answering questions, we've put our details up again. So if you want to find us, you know where.
He was first.
There's a Yes, so there are now.
Read the question.
I can't remember the whole question now. So the question was, when you are using Git integration, can you automate the entire process? And the short answer is yes. And there's even APIs now to help with all of this as well. So there's now Microsoft have released Fabric APIs to help with deployments. Not only can you automate it, you can actually take it a step further and do so many other things with it now. So it's worth looking at those APIs. Any other questions? You said there was another hand up.
Any common mistakes that we have with Azure DevOps?
I had to bite my tongue there. Let's put it this way. One simple answer is classic pipelines are really good for getting a good understanding of Azure DevOps, but long term, you should look to use the YAML pipelines for multiple reasons, including, like I said earlier, you cannot do pull requests on classic pipelines.
And make sure that your branching models are integrated correctly. So it does support your development process.
There's another question over there. No, I can answer this.
Yeah.
They are very, very similar.
Yeah.
So the only thing that's really different is the YAML schema convention, slightly different. In fact, if you look behind the scenes, the actual virtual machine images used for Azure pipeline agents are exactly the same ones that are used for GitHub Action Runners. It's the same image. It's the only difference is one works for Azure DevOps, the other one works for GitHub. That's it.
No more questions?
So the question was, is it possible to share agents between projects? And yes, if you specify them at the organization level. If you create agent pools at the organization level, like I showed earlier, then you can use those agent pools with multiple projects. Yeah, exactly. It is possible.
Yeah. Great. I think we're out of time.
We are out of time. If anyone's got any questions, we can have a cheeky last minute question. Nope. In that case, thank you very much, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoy the rest of your event.